As a tax accountant, my focus, of course, coming out of school is to do accounting and file taxes. Numbers are my thing. As a student and getting into the world of accounting, I had an opportunity to work with a tax preparer who was involved within the medical community. His clients were primarily medical doctors. And fortunately for me, because of the medical doctors' interest within the community, I had opportunity to come out to groups such as this, as an example, and offer what we call free tax clinics. And I'm sure many of you have heard or seen or have heard people talk about tax clinics, where you would come out and sit down and bring your information, and somebody would either help you with filing your taxes, or they would file them on your behalf or guide you. So that being said, in doing these tax clinics, I had the opportunity to sit and chat with people. And so this was Ted. He was 18 years old. He had a mental illness. He came to me through the Ontario Disability Program. After a very few minutes of discussion with Ted, I had the opportunity to ask some questions. And part of my questioning, because as a female, most females are very nosy, and they like to find out what's going on, and, how did you get here, Ted, and who do you live with? And so from just some general questioning, I was able to find out a little bit about Ted. So because Ted's mother had brought him, I brought her into the conversation. And in asking her some very simple questions, I was able to determine that although Ted had a modest income through the Ontario Disability Program, he was financially dependent still on his mother, even though he's an adult. And this is quite a common situation. And so after asking various questions to Mom, it was obvious that Mom was still very involved in the financial well-being of her son. And so I'm here today to share with you a lot of information that will open your mind to some of the situations that you may not think about when you sit with your tax accountant. Or perhaps today, you're someone who files your taxes on your own through an electronic filing program. So what we did, we looked at the bigger picture. So after speaking to Ted's mother, it was obvious that Ted's mother was involved with providing monies for school, therapies, transportation, and various medical appointments. So if Mom is involved in all of these costs, is Mom claiming any of these things? And it was very obvious that Mom had no idea, and she was not. So that leads us into why I would want to come here tonight to talk about taxes with a prostate cancer support group. Because like Ted and Ted's mother, many people are not aware of the changes that take place every year within the tax legislation. And that would be federal changes and as well provincial changes. And in a lot of cases, when people are not aware of these changes, what happens? People miss out. And just like Ted, in asking these very simple questions, where Ted lived, what did Mom contribute to? And these very simple questions led me to help Ted's mother in not only filing her taxes along with Ted, but ensuring that she was filing them accurately. And that's really very important. And so without my assistance, what was the likelihood of Ted and his family having access to the resources needed to have those accurate tax filings? Because you see, as the tax department continues to make changes, a lot of the changes are advertised out in the community, either through posters, the government is involved with media advertising, and you see where there would be different members of the community that are within the government who will also share information. So unfortunately, because Canada Revenue Agency is the organization that manages our taxes, a lot of people, for whatever reason, they don't engage conversation with the tax department. How many people here call the tax department on a regular basis to ask them questions? And so this is part of the challenge that many people have, because what they assume or what they hear, they apply to themselves without becoming advocates for each individual person, if that makes sense. So there are no two taxpayers alike. Every person in this room has different incomes, different expenses. And so, like Ted's family, the likelihood of them receiving all of the tax benefits that potentially they would be eligible for was probably not that great, because mother had no idea what was available to her. And even if she engaged conversation with the tax department, if you don't know the right questions to ask, they wouldn't know how to advise you. And quite often, even in dealing with the tax department, some of the answers you get today are not accurate, because what they often will do is they'll do the same thing you can do, which is Google it to find out, believe it or not. So a lot of the questions that I had surrounding Ted dealt, of course, with his disability and or medical issue. So that being said, quite often, to corroborate that information, we would need information from Ted's doctors. Any person who is involved in the medical well-being of Ted as an individual. So if we think about that today, many years ago, people would have a family doctor or a practitioner that managed their medical condition. But as we all know, sitting in this room, the number of medical people that are involved in our care today are not limited to one. There are various. And often those people don't communicate. So this sometimes creates barriers in order to obtain accurate information to furnish to the tax department to make sure that we are claiming the things that are appropriate. And then take into consideration the very last point, which is electronic software. And I heard someone had a comment as I came in, what do I think of TurboTax and some of these tax programs? Of course, these tax programs are amazing. They help people significantly, because I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity of filing your taxes on a paper return, but it's quite easy to make a boo-boo. So these tax software programs are very helpful, but they're helpful for the general population. People who have few T-slips, every year their situation is relatively the same. When you have people that fit within the disability or medical community, what often happens is their circumstances are quite a bit different. And the reason they are different is because everybody's form of treatment and care is different. Some people have different medical requirements, they have different expenses, they see practitioners in different areas, they have different living requirements, and notwithstanding the fact they have different income and different expenses. So it makes sense to assume that if you are within the disability and or medical community, that these type of tax software programs may not be your best course of action. Does that make sense? Okay, so I want to share with you some information, because this is a picture of paper filing, and I'm sure nobody here does that anymore. As a tax accountant, I can't even paper file on your behalf, because we get a fine now if we paper file, $25 fine per return, believe that. And if you file a corporate return, believe it or not, the fines can be $500 up to $1,000. People will often call an accountant or go to an accountant, and they assume that every accountant has all knowledge on accounting. Well, yes, we all study from the same principles, and we all use pretty much the same guidelines when we go through our program. But one of the things that's important to understand is you are in a specialized group. You are between 12 and 15% of the population that has a prolonged illness, injury, a disability, or medical condition. So if you're in an accounting profession, it stands to reason that you're going to focus your energies on the bulk of the population. That would be potentially the other 85%. So there are not a lot of accounting professionals that focus just strictly in this area. And so it's important to note that if you are trying to seek information, that you do find a practitioner that is knowledgeable, because if you have a farming business, it only makes sense that you would go to a tax accountant that's familiar with the farming industry. It's no different than if you go to court because you have a civil matter. It wouldn't make sense for you to take your real estate lawyer with you to assist you. Does that make sense? We'll go back to Ted's family. So even if Ted's family was able to access all of the information needed, that would be their medical practitioner, deal with the tax department, and gather all the right forms, often Ted and his family, even though they have all the information, they don't know how to facilitate that information. Just a quick example, the software that we use is a very standard software. And if I were filing a tax return for 2 people with a disability who were being supported by a family member, that tax program would require 24 of these red check marks. These are overrides. An override is where you have to go into the program, and even though a number will come up because of a calculation, you have to go in and change that. So what you have to do is override it and then put in your own information. And this is where these programs often fall short. And so because of these software programs that people are using every day, it's more and more prevalent that we see the boo-boos. And then these boo-boos allow people to overpay their taxes, which allows the government then to receive more of your money, and they keep it. They don't call you and say, oh, by the way, you've overpaid your taxes. Has anybody had those kind of phone calls? No, I know I've not. So you see this last statement, access is not limited to a ramp. It's so important for people to understand what the changes are year over year and how you need to investigate or how you need to become advocates. After 23 years and more than 25,000 clients, it is obvious that people, unfortunately, don't always know exactly what is available. So some of the very important things I want to talk about tonight are the medical expense credits. Within this community, people don't realize that medical expenses can be pretty much any expense that you incur because of yours or your loved one's medical condition. I hope everyone received one of those black folders. The reason I hand those out is often when I sit and chat with people, they say, oh my gosh, Christine, I didn't know and I didn't keep those receipts. So if you would like more than 1, 2, 4 of those folders, for goodness sake, I'll give them to you. Because when I meet with families or individuals that are struggling with a medical condition, an illness, a disability, or an injury, it is very painful when I sit there and hear their story to know that had they met me 4 years or 5 years ago or 8 years ago or 10 years ago, I could have financially changed their quality of life. I couldn't do anything about their illness, but sometimes those financial contributions that I could have helped them make could have done some type of improvement. Does that make sense? So I want you to think about those things because it's very important for people to be aware. When it comes to medical credits, medical expense credits, most people can think of a medical expense, your prescriptions, a cane, a walker, a wheelchair. But what about all of the other expenses that people have? Okay, personal hygiene products. I'm sure that's very, very necessary within this group. Peer counseling, family counseling, support. If you called CRA today and asked them if you could claim your marriage counseling on your taxes, I'm going to tell you they're going to have a good chuckle. But if you're struggling because of some issues and it's affecting you and your relationship because of your illness or because of your treatment, that is all part and parcel of your medical condition. Does that make sense? I don't know if everyone here is familiar with MapleSoft Center. but I do a lot of work with the MapleSoft Center. And it's interesting because there are so many people that go through that facility, and each and every one of them have a different story. But sometimes the stories, until you really ask the questions, you never really get the right answers. The answers were always there, it's just nobody knew enough what to ask for. I'll give you a little quick story that I recently met with a family. It was a young lady who was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had 3 children, and she lived with her father, who had just recently passed away from an illness that was very sudden. So the children were devastated because they lost their father figure, and they know their mother is sick with cancer. And to children, or to anybody, cancer is a scary word. Not everyone understands. The oldest daughter was 14, or is 14, and she doesn't go to school. She's scared to go to school. She's scared to leave her mother's side. So with that being said, would you qualify her as having a disability or a medical illness? When you think about it, no, not really. She has anxiety. But that anxiety creates an infirmity. And that infirmity is something that is eligible to be claimed on tax returns. So can you see how sometimes what we think and what are 2 very different things? Does that make sense? So you probably wouldn't think of a situation like that, but often we see very similar situations. So I also want to talk about legal house. I'm not a lawyer, I am an accountant, and it's very important for me to give you that disclaimer. However, as an accountant that deals with people who have disabilities or medical conditions, prolonged illness, it's very important for me to share with you that if your legal house is not in order, it can create some problems down the road. And so there are so many different ways of ensuring that what you want for your life and for end of life can be adhered to. You see, most people, when they prepare their legal house, they worry about what if I die, so they have a will. But what if you live? Have you thought about that? Because I deal with the families who deal with those people who never thought about what if I live. And they have to deal with the care and the cost, and they have to try to figure out the best wishes based on how well they know you and what perhaps you've said over your lifetime. So can you imagine the grief and the turmoil that creates for families? It's quite significant. So another big area where people make boo-boos is who should claim what. Now we all are very familiar with the income splitting situation. Everyone has heard of that. I'm sure there's many people in this room who practice income splitting. But some of the pitfalls of income splitting is if you share your income with a loved one and your loved one becomes ill and they have to have a certain level of care, sometimes that care can be compromised because of the income splitting. Sometimes that care, the cost is overstated because you overstated income because of income splitting. And sometimes what happens is due to income splitting, the income going to the individual that requires care, if there's an increase or an artificial increase and the cost is much higher for the care subject to that, you can see how problems will arise. Does that make sense? So I just want to talk to you about some of the other medical expenses that I see very regular that people don't think about, and I did mention them earlier, which would be family counseling, peer support counseling. I'm sure not much different than perhaps some of you have sought. Another thing that's really important for people within the disability and medical community is alternate therapies or alternative therapies. As I said to you earlier, in the past, most people would have 1 or 2 practitioners dealing with their medical condition. That was very common. But today, people are looking to various forms of relief because of their condition. And so you have to consider that if you're engaging in some of these alternate therapies, and it's becoming more of the mainstream, that those costs, given the right documentation, would be eligible to claim. But if you just go on CRA's website and look at the medical expenses that are eligible and the ones that aren't, often the ones that are listed that are not eligible, they can actually be claimed given the right information, the right documentation. So I do want to point that out. Another area that people often make errors is out-of-country expenses. And once again, because now the world has become a much smaller place, hasn't it? We heard a comment about one of your members or board members being away but still answering his email. Isn't that amazing that we can do that today? So the world has become much smaller. Out-of-country therapies are becoming much more mainstream. And so these as well are allowable expenses given the right documentation. So when it comes to dealing with the disability component of your medical condition or the disability tax credit application, people who fit within this group, the prostate cancer group, because of your medical condition, chances of qualifying, they're pretty good. But you need a good practitioner to outline exactly what your issues are, and also you need good documentation as to your overall treatment and what are the effects, the side effects, okay? So we're going to talk about the disability tax credit. That's the DTC, we'll refer to that here. That's a T2201. Has anyone in the room heard of that form? Anybody? Yeah. So the disability tax credit is something that is available for taxpayers to help reduce their taxes at filing, to give you that little extra for the things that you have to purchase because of your condition or your illness, just to help you to improve your life. It's not going to give you any great thousands of dollars, but it will reduce your taxes year over year. So obviously you need doctors to complete this form, and once again, it's not just your medical practitioner. You can have your specialist complete the form, a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So it is not focused only on the medical community. I'm just going to give you a brief, can everyone see that? So this is one of the sections from the form that would apply to probably most of you in the room. So you can see under the elimination category, it's one of the categories, where it talks about people having a marked restriction. Okay, so they use, the tax department uses these keywords: marked restriction, all or substantially all of the time. And they give some examples. The reason I wanted to point this out is because of these type of wording, it's sometimes ambiguous, and not everyone totally perceives these few sentences in the same way. I can tell you I've seen thousands and thousands of these forms, and I know exactly the wording that has to go on them. There are several ways of explaining the same thing. If I started at one end of the first row and told a story in your ear, and then had you continue the story on and on and on and on, by the time it got to the end, chances are it'd be a pretty different story, wouldn't it? So that's just a quick example of how a statement or a story can be changed just by one person sharing that information with another person, because each person will add something or remove something. But you're trying to tell the spirit of the same story. And this is exactly what happens within the medical community, because different practitioners share different words and their knowledge of the same condition. So the point I'm getting at is you could fill this room with people with type 1 diabetes, which would be insulin dependent. And you would have people that would be in wheelchairs, some people that would be blind, some people with renal failure or that would have a kidney removed or replaced. But you would also have marathon runners. You would have people that are extremely fit. So you see, it's not necessarily the disease or the condition that qualifies you. It's essentially the effects of that disease or condition. So I just want to point those issues out. So I briefly talked about income splitting. Is it the right thing to do? And I did share with you some of the issues that we see with respect to income splitting. So what is most important when you are income splitting is to consider, if I income split, the benefit is going to be X, based on, of course, reduction of taxes, because that is the overall benefit, right? That's your purpose. But as your situation may change, or your loved one's situation may change, you have to always consider this material change that has taken place. Is it now still beneficial for us to continue to income split? And the reason I bring that up is when I see people that are dealing with someone in a nursing environment, often there are consequences to income splitting that are not positive. And if you've just had to place your loved one in a nursing environment after 40, 50, or 60 years of them being your best friend, lover, spouse, you're not worrying about the financial consequences of your taxes while you're dealing with this very emotional endeavor. And sometimes people continue the status quo just because they don't have the time or the wherewithal to investigate, and they find out that they once again overpaid their taxes. And I'll tell you, there are some situations that's very difficult to reverse if you fall into some of these categories. And that's why we point this out. So just briefly, I want to continue on with the income splitting and then talk to you a little bit about some of the consequences. So some of the things that we see when people are in this environment is the person at home is sometimes left without income to support the household. We see where they're forced to take mortgages or sell property, and it's needless. It doesn't make sense because it's not necessary. There are checks and balances that are available to assist these people, but they didn't know enough to ask, and nobody knew enough to tell them. We live in a community now where we have declining services. I don't know if anybody here previously worked for the tax department or still work for the tax department, any accounting professionals? So in the past, what would happen, there would be members within the community, and they would go out and do the volunteer clinics. And also they would have special offices set up temporarily during tax season. But they don't have that anymore. And so a lot of people are left to deal with these extra situations without knowledge, without assistance or guidance. And I'm going to say something about your generation. You're just a little bit older than me, and I'm pretty stubborn. You don't ask. And men particularly are very private and proud. So when you're dealing with health or finances, I find a lot of people, they struggle with asking for assistance because they want to deal with things on their own. And especially when you're dealing with the care of yourself or a loved one, it's a very personal thing. And so you don't want some stranger involved. But it is good to seek advice from people who are familiar with this, because hopefully you'll only go through this once or maybe twice in your lifetime. You need assistance from people who have done this time and time and time again. So I'm going to skip over to the top 10 questions that you should ask while shopping for a tax planner. And it just makes sense. You want to know how long have they been in business. That's very important. You also need to know about hidden costs. And what are the costs versus the benefit? That's a big one. Do you meet people in person? Is the person or the people that you're going to meet, are they aware what will be available for you given your specific situation? Yes. You see, one of the challenges, as I said earlier, is people assume because they are going to an accountant to seek advice that that accountant knows everything. And you see, that's very difficult because it's impossible to know everything. And one of the things that I find that's interesting is, and this has happened to me over the course of my life as in practice, is that if I didn't ask, the person didn't know enough to tell me, or they didn't know enough to ask, right? Now, I'm sure there's several of you in this room, and forgive me, I'm going to be very personal. You know, hygiene products for men, because of their treatment from prostate cancer, can become very costly. Yet I can tell you, I've done work for prostate groups all across Southern Ontario, and not one of them ever said to me, by the way, Christine, can I claim any of those things? Yet I bet you I've had probably about 6,000 prostate survivors sit over the desk from me. You see, so in a lot of cases, if they didn't know enough to ask, and your accountant didn't know enough to ask, you can see that there would be some issue. Does that make sense? And so that's why it's important for people to find out, investigate, and then have somebody who can grow with you. Because when you deal with illness or injury, unfortunately, in many cases, the situation doesn't go back to the way it was before the illness or injury. Often, even if the treatment is successful, there are some consequences from the treatment. So maybe the illness has subsided, but the consequences from the treatment have now had an effect adversely, either on your health or on some component of your life. So can you see how that disconnect can create some issues? Does anybody else have a question? Yes?
How about parking costs and transportation when you're your own, or with your partner who's taking you there?
That's right. Anything over 40 kilometers allowed, parking is allowed. If you have to pay for transportation, of course, that is allowed. Yes.
And now, what signature do you need for that? Just your home address and the hospital address?
Correct.
Back it up?
Yeah. Or even just an appointment card. We usually can do that. I mean, the tax department is very aggressive in the area of medical expenses, I will tell you, because that's the area of the largest amount of fraud. However, it's also the area that people, you know, they don't claim. And so it is very important, because I'm sure nobody in this room who would go down to the local car dealership would say to the salesman, well, you know what, I have an extra $1,000 in my bank account. I'm going to give it to you. You just wouldn't do that. But we do it on our tax returns every year. One of the most important things, keep receipts, write stuff down. If the doctor says to you, you know what, because of your illness or your condition or your loved one's illness or condition, you need this. Just ask them to write it on a prescription pad and sign it and put a date on it. You don't need a fancy letter, but you do need some documentation. Because if you claim something because the doctor suggested it to you or told you you should do that for yourself or your loved one, and you don't have that documentation, and then you go back to see your practitioner and ask him to write a letter, can you imagine how many conversations your practitioner has in a day, a month, a week? He'll never remember that. So it is so important. You need to really think about being advocates, because as we continue to live longer, because there are better therapies, better treatments, better medications, as we realize the foods we put in our mouth and we start paying attention to our health, and we do live better and longer lives, we're going to have to start keeping track of this stuff much longer. You know, I have actually met people that have been retired longer than they've worked. Last year in my practice alone, I had 12 people over the age of 100. You know, that's pretty significant, because I'll tell you, 15 years ago, I never had one. So we have to start paying attention, because as we live longer and as we battle different conditions, different illnesses or injuries, I shared with John earlier, I spent a year in a wheelchair. I had a surgery a few years ago that didn't go the right way. I fortunately or unfortunately, I have Irish and Scottish blood. That's where I get my red hair and my fiery temper. And I'm not the greatest healer. I take a very long time, and I'm an extremely impatient person. So I didn't take the time that was necessary. And because of that, I put myself on a ski hill on a very difficult run, thinking that I could ski jump like my daughter. Didn't look that hard, but I just wasn't ready. And so I went from one serious injury, spending a whole year in bed, to another. So you can imagine how frustrating that was. But I spent a year in a wheelchair, and it was very difficult. And the consequences of that episode, my medical expenses for that year were over $10,000. I had to have a knee replacement, and now I suffer consequences, and I will for the rest of my life. Now I've had 7 knee surgeries in total. And so you can imagine, and that's just from, a few boo-boos. Now I work out every day, but I'll tell you, I still spend a lot of money on different treatments, different therapies. Physiotherapy, primarily one of them. Injections, hyaluronic acid injections, they work for me, they're not covered. So they're very costly. And because I am impatient, I often will get MRIs because I don't like to wait, although the MRI list is getting much shorter. But those are things that people, you just don't think about because it's not severe. So if you're dealing with something that is severe, think of the cost of that. So I want to share with you one more thing, and it's really important for me because although I'm here to talk to you as prostate cancer survivors, I want to also talk to you about community members and family members. We deal with people within the disability community every day. And there's no one in this room who doesn't know someone or has a loved one that does not have either a disability, an illness, injury, or some medical condition. Am I right? Right. And so that being said, we often see families who pool resources to assist their loved ones, because that's what we do. We help. I myself cared for my grandmother who was in a nursing home in Nova Scotia. She had severe diabetes, and she required foot care every week. And the rules there are very similar to here in Ontario. The nursing staff are not allowed to touch their feet unless they have certification to do that. I don't know if you're aware of that. So you had to pay someone to come in to manage her foot care. So I took care of that. I live here in Ottawa. My grandmother, as I said, lived in Nova Scotia. She just thought the lady was super duper, never sent her a bill. But you see, I could claim that on my taxes. My grandmother doesn't live with me. So when you think about that example, think about all the people that we know who cover the cost or assist in the cost of their loved one. I'm sure there's a lot of people we can think of right now, if not maybe one of ourselves. I was recently at a presentation last Sunday for a very large group, 200 people with RE/MAX. And you'll probably wonder, why would you be at a real estate function? Well, the real estate, I spoke to several of the real estate agents in this one RE/MAX office, not far from here. And they deal a lot with people who are upsizing. We've all heard the word downsizing, where you leave your home to go to a smaller accommodation. Most people think of that as they get older. They become empty nesters and you go to a smaller home. But often we see people who have taken in their loved ones, their parents, grandparents, siblings, grandchildren because of illness, injury, or medical condition or disability, and now they need larger accommodations. I know my parents lived with me for 5 years while my mother and my father were going through their treatments. They were very ill and they couldn't manage. They had 4 flights of stairs in their house. And so these are situations that we see very regularly, but we don't really think about until it's kind of hitting us in the face. So there are so many things that the tax department has done to make changes to the income tax to allow us to pay for renovations because of medical conditions if we have to move someone in. Also, there is something called a Healthy Homes Credit. Is anyone in the room aware of that? Yes? A Healthy Homes Credit is a credit that's eligible for people over the age of 65, seniors, to make modifications to the home to make it better, to improve their quality of life. A good example would be to remove a faucet that has a difficult turning if you have osteoarthritis or some hand issue. And get those cool touchless faucets. We've all seen them. Another thing would be to install a electronic garage door opener, because some people, because of back injury or what have you, they just can't pull that garage door anymore. Removing the doors where you have to turn the knob, where you have now those doors that you can push the handle down. Or the keyless entry system, so you don't have to deal with keys, because some people have such difficulty with that. I could stand here and tell you examples for hours. I won't bore you. Taxes are boring enough. But what is important is you need to start thinking about these things. The tax department is doing their part. But because people don't know enough to ask, they don't know enough to know that they don't know, they miss out. People are caring for their loved ones, their families, they're pooling resources, they assist, and that's wonderful. And the tax department wants you to do that. That's why they're giving you these tax breaks. But I'll tell you, if we don't utilize them, they'll reallocate those monies to a different program and we'll lose them. Does that make sense? And so we have to think about these things. And as well, the senior population, you're taxed heavily. Personally, I think anybody over the age of 75 shouldn't have to pay taxes, but I guess that doesn't work. But it's interesting because, we're taxed every year, we have to file every year, and we need to also educate ourselves as to the changes that take place year over year. And notwithstanding the fact that most of our tax situations, because you are now in a specialized group, you're no longer in the normal group. Once you deal with an illness, a disability, an injury, prolonged medical condition, sorry to tell you, but you're specialized. So you may have expenses this year, you may have more expenses next year, you may have hardly any the year after, you may care for someone this year, that person may move into another person's home next year, so you can see how scenarios can change. So you have to make sure that when you apply your taxes, that you're applying these scenarios to the taxes. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share. When I deal with people within the disability and medical community, it's such a very personal and private issue. I really appreciate you allowing me this opportunity, because by empowering people with information gets the dialogue going. And it's by getting the dialogue going that we start to think, and then you'll kind of come up with a question. So I just wanted to bring that up because I'm going to have these little tickets that will go around. I would like everyone to please put your name, your phone number, and your email. We're going to do a draw for a $50 gift card, and I will send that out to you. And it's one of three. It can be for a Tim Hortons gift card, a Home Depot, or a gas card. So just write on which one you would prefer, and whoever is drawn for that, that's the card you would get. And that's my gift to you. So if you would like our firm or somebody from our firm to call or meet with you or come and chat with you, we'd be more than happy. Our fees, there's no upfront cost. We do taxes, which are a regular cost. It's not much different than H&R Block or any of the other preparers. If you want us to look at any information with respect to what you've done previously, how we work our services, if we do work for you retroactively, which means if we go back 10 years to recover any of the expenses that you did not claim or that you didn't know you were eligible for, and we have to get things approved for you, our fee is industry standard, the 30%. And if we get nothing for you, there's no cost to you whatsoever. All right, so if anybody in the room is behind in their taxes, trust me, I'm very good at bringing tax returns up to date. And don't be embarrassed, because there are many people that get in the situation and they fall behind in taxes because life gets in the way. I deal with people every day where life is so much more important than paperwork. I totally get it. So if there's anything we can do to help, we can gather information from the CRA with your permission. There are so many different ways to get to the end result. Our goal is to help you. We want to help. Our goal is to improve the financial position of those that endure so much. If anybody is involved in another group or organization, or if you'd like me to come back and speak, again, I would be more than happy. Because if I can share my message with one person, then guess what? I bored one more person, but I might have enlightened them at the same time. Thank you very much.